The Orioles still may decide to hire their interim manager. How has that worked out for teams in the recent past? We'll dive into that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, October 3rd, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the history, at least the recent history, of teams hiring their interim managers, firing a manager, giving the interim tag to somebody, and then keeping them on full-time and giving them an extension. We'll look at the situations where it actually worked out and the situations where it didn't to kind of compare it to, hey, if the Orioles did make that decision with Tony Mansolino, what are maybe the chances that it does work for the O's? And then we've learned about even more managerial openings across baseball. At the end of the show, I wanted to give kind of the rankings of the 8 managerial openings. Like, if you're the best candidate out there and the Orioles offer you the job, where do they rank on the list? We'll get to that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Download the FanDuel app today. So Tony Mansolino took over for the Orioles as interim manager back in mid-May when Brandon Hyde was fired after a 15-28 start to the year. Mansolino guided the Orioles to a 60-59 record down the stretch. Of course, they still finished with 75 wins, well outside the playoffs. But of course, Mansolino's roster was hurt by injuries. It was stripped down to the studs somewhat when the Orioles traded away, 9 major leaguers in and around the deadline this year, basically had a completely new bullpen by the end of the season. And I thought overall he did a good job in his 119 games as interim manager. Mike Elias and Mansolino spoke to the media on Monday in kind of their postseason press conference. And Elias said that they are opening a search for a manager and that Mansolino is one of those candidates. But he neither said, yeah, we're going to move on from Mansolino, nor did he say, hey, we're immediately giving him the job fully. What that tells to me is it's more than likely that the Orioles will hire an outside candidate and will not promote Mansolino to that role. And he's probably going to go and work for another team in 2026. But Elias did leave the door open. And I think it's because Mansolino overall did do a good job. He got a vote of confidence from a lot of the younger players in that clubhouse. That at least allows him to stay in this mix. So I wanted to take a look back at, has it really worked out for teams in the past when they've had an interim manager and then they've kept them on long term? It has for some, and it hasn't for others. But I wanted to start with the hires that did work. We got a couple different ones of guys who, at least until just a couple of days ago, most of these guys had been still big league managers for their team. Let's start with the one that has probably worked, maybe not the best, but close to the best in recent memory, and that is Rob Thomson with the Phillies in 2022. The Phillies, who had brought in Joe Girardi in 2020, it just didn't go well with him after he began the 2022 season at 22-29 with all the talent on that Phillies team. They fired Girardi and they named his bench coach, Rob Thomson, as the interim manager. Now, Thomson had been with the Phillies as their bench coach since 2018. He was initially hired as the bench coach as Gabe Kapler's bench coach when he was the Phillies manager. Kapler was fired after 2019. They actually considered giving Thomson the job then. He didn't get it, but he kept his bench coach position when they hired Girardi because Girardi and Thomson were super close. Rob Thomson was the bench coach for the Yankees under Joe Girardi for 10 years from 2008 to 2017, including winning a World Series title in that first year. That's really the only reason Thomson elected to stay when he didn't get the Phillies job, and he had been coaching forever in the Yankee system. He was a coach in the minors or the major leagues all the way dating back to 1990 until he left for the Phillies. So Thomson takes over and has incredible success. He goes 65-46 down the stretch as the Phillies manager in 2022, turns the season around, has great postseason success, and leads the Phillies to the 2022 World Series. Now, they would lose that World Series to the Astros, but to get to the World Series as an interim manager is pretty impressive. And it was kind of a no-brainer for the Phillies after that season to name Thomson their full-time manager and give him an extension. Now, he has made the playoffs in each of the last 3 seasons since then as well. They, in 2023, were a wild card, but did get ousted in the NLCS by the Diamondbacks, and they have now come off back-to-back NL East titles and will begin their play in the NLDS against the Dodgers this weekend. So I would say this move has really worked out for the Phillies, keeping Thompson on board. Now, the thing with Thompson was, while he had never been a big league manager, he had been a big league bench coach for, you're looking at 15 years with 2 good teams in the Phillies and the Yankees. Before he was given that job, he'd been a coach since 1990. He'd really seen it all except for being in the managerial chair. Now, there are some Phillies fans who don't love Rob Thompson, and some of the magic from 2022 has worn off on him, but it's a very talented team, but he's clearly guiding them in the right directions, and that's one where it seemed to work out. However, it's not the perfect comparison to Mansolino, because Mansolino didn't take his team to the World Series and turn his team's season around. Yeah, did he have a winning record, but this team was still a bad team that missed the playoffs. Next one up, which is actually a little bit closer to Tony Mansolino, is Brian Snitker, who we just learned is kind of somewhat stepping down from Braves managerial role. It looks like he's going to stay on in some sort of front office capacity with Atlanta, but that is another managerial opening this offseason for the Braves, which we are going to get to in a moment. But Brian Snitker with the Braves in 2016. Freddie Gonzalez, who then went on to become the Orioles bench coach for a while eventually, was fired by the Braves in May of 2016, and Snitker was named the interim manager. Now, Snitker was not the bench coach at that time for the Braves, but he had been in their system forever. Snitker was first hired as a coach in the Braves system in 1980. Yes, at that point, he already had 36 years in the system. He had coached and managed all throughout the minor leagues, was promoted to the big league staff to be their third base coach from 2007 through 2013, including working under Freddie Gonzalez. Then in 2014, the Braves gave him a different role. They named him AAA manager, so he went back to the minor leagues, and that's where he was in May of 2016 when Snitker was fired, and he was basically promoted from that role, when Gonzalez was fired, Snitker was promoted to that big league managerial role. Now, it didn't go great down the stretch. He went 59-65 down the stretch. In 2016, the Braves didn't make the playoffs, but they decided, that Snitker had been in their organization for almost 40 years. They loved him as a person. They did not want to move on from him and decided this was his time to be the manager. So they did extend him, and it didn't immediately pay off. Now, that situation is much closer to the situation Mansolino is in, except for, Mansolino has been in the O system since 2021. That's 5 years instead of 35 years. But Snitker didn't have success the next year. In his first full season, the Braves went 72-90 in 2017. And I'm sure Atlanta fans, even though they were going through a little bit of a mini rebuild or at least a retool, were probably a bit worried. But he kept the job. And in 2018, they started to win again. And 2018 began a stretch of 6 consecutive NL East Division titles for the Atlanta Braves with Snitker at the helm, which of course included the Braves winning the 2021 World Series. They made the playoffs again last year, but as a wild card, and then missed the playoffs entirely this year. There were more injury issues, got off to a terrible start, similar to the Orioles, and just could never turn things around. And now that is it as manager for Snitker. Now, again, it ended up with him losing the job, not in like the worst of terms. But I would say the move to Snitker definitely worked out. When you get 6 straight division titles and a World Series championship out of a guy who was initially an interim manager, that's almost the best that this scenario can go. So if the O's hired Mansolino and he did that over the next 6 years, we would all be absolutely loving Tony Mansolino at this point and building a statue maybe outside of Oriole Park. But again, Snitker, in terms of the situation when he took over, is more similar to Mansolino, but the background is much different. Again, for a guy who was in the Braves organization for 35 years, and they knew pretty much every single thing you could know about him except for how would he do as a big league manager, because again, he had not managed a big league team before he got that Braves interim job in 2016. And the final one that I think has worked out to this point is John Schneider, that same 2022 season with the Toronto Blue Jays. Charlie Montoyo was fired as Blue Jays manager in July of 2022, with the Jays sitting in the playoff race at 46-42, but underachieving a little bit. Schneider was the bench coach at the time, and he was elevated to interim manager. Now, Schneider had just taken the bench coach job. He was hired in that role before the 2022 season, but he had been on the Blue Jays staff since 2019 in the big leagues, mostly as the catching coach and one of the other major league coaches. So he'd been around that dugout for a little bit. That is probably the closest situation to Tony Mansolino, right? 4-ish years in the dugout as a coach, but never really the bench coach for that long, and then getting elevated to interim manager. Now, Schneider, the big difference again from Mansolino is that when he joined the MLB staff in 2019, he didn't come from another organization. Remember, the Orioles hired Mansolino away from Cleveland, where he had been a coach for a while. Schneider had been in the Blue Jays organization. He was initially hired in 2008 as a hitting coach for the FCL Blue Jays, was the manager of that team in 2009, and then he managed at every Toronto minor league level except for AAA from 2009 through 2018. So he had a lot of managerial experience in the minors in their system, although he didn't have any big league managerial experience. And again, kind of like Thompson, Schneider had a lot of success, which is what Mansolino record-wise didn't really have. John Schneider managed the team to a 46-28 record down the stretch. They made the playoffs as a wild card team that year. Now, they were swept in the wild card by the Mariners, including when they blew that just crazy 8-1 lead they had in game 2 of that wild card series against Seattle. But Schneider kept it going. The Blue Jays went 89-73 in 2023 in Schneider's first full season, as they gave him the vote of confidence and gave him the full-time managerial role. And they again made the playoffs as the wild card, but they were again swept out of the wild card round that year. And then they took a major step back. The Blue Jays had a super disappointing year last year, went 74-88, of course, missed the postseason. And a lot of people were calling for Schneider's head because although he got into the playoffs twice, they hadn't won a playoff game. And then they took a huge step back, kind of similar to the Brandon Hyde spot, just with less of a track record as the manager. But with him on the hot seat this year, he stepped up to the challenge. The Blue Jays came out there and won 94 games this season and won the American League East. Now, the team has not been dominant, but they kind of look like the 2023 Orioles. It's a very, very similar team. They won the AL East, and they're going to be hosting, the top seed playing in the ALDS this weekend as Schneider looks for his first postseason win as manager. Again, it hasn't gone to the heights that it has for Thompson or Snitker, with a World Series appearance for Thompson, and of course, a World Series win for Snitker. But it's been a positive hire, I think, that has worked out for John Schneider getting that job full-time. All of these have some similarities to Mansolino, but not exactly the situation Mansolino's been in. And the other thing is that, the Orioles sold at the deadline more than any of these teams or these managers' teams did in their first season as interim. It made Mansolino's job a little bit different, but still, it's not exactly the same story. So what about the ones that didn't work? There's plenty of interim managers who just do the job and then they don't get the job full time, but there are some guys who get it full time long term and it doesn't work out. We'll talk about some of those and how they compare to Tony Mansolino coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. Every day we make decisions, but on Prize Picks, being right can actually get you paid. Don't miss the excitement of this football season with Prize Picks, where it is good to be right. Playing Prize Picks is such a fun and simple way to add more excitement to football. You just pick more or less on player projections like Josh Allen's passing yards or Saquon Barkley rushing for a touchdown, and you're in the game. And I just love how quick it is. You can make your lineup in under a minute. And you can also follow players on the app, copy their lineups with just one click. You think someone's doing well and you want to do well too. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. It's at Prize Picks. It's good to be right. So for Tony Mansolino, coming off his job as interim manager, it's still up in the air whether or not he's going to get this job. We talked about some of the interim managers who got the job and did well. Let's talk about some of the semi-recent ones who got it and it didn't go well. And I think one thing to really note about this is, Snitker was 2016. That's almost 10 years ago. But Thompson and Schneider were in 2022. That's fairly recently where this happened. The ones where it didn't work were a little further back. We're going into like the more of the 2000s for some of these. And the reason why I have to stretch back, almost 20 years to get some of these examples is that teams generally don't keep the interim manager. Some of that is because when they fire a manager, they want to shake things up in the clubhouse. And when you're hiring an interim manager, it's usually just someone you've promoted from that same clubhouse, so you want a different voice. Or it's because, hey, things aren't going well. You fire a manager. It's really hard to completely turn things around in a season. So maybe the year ends with the interim manager. Things still aren't going well, kind of similar to what it was with the Orioles. And you just want a fresh start with a new voice in there. Here's some teams, though, that still went with the interim guy, and it did not work out. How about the Cubs in 2010 with Mike Quade? Lou Piniella suddenly retired in August of 2010 as Cubs manager, and Quade took over as the interim manager. Now, Quade did well down the stretch. The Cubs were not a good team. They didn't make the playoffs, but he went 24-13 with that Cubs team in the games he managed for the month and a half at the end of the season, and the Cubs gave Quade a 2-year contract to continue as the full-time manager. It didn't work. The next year in 2011, in his first full year, the Cubs went 71-91, and they didn't even allow him to play out the second year on that contract. He was fired after the 2011 season. And Quade, he'd been on the staff for a little bit. He was the Cubs' third base coach starting in 2007 before he was elevated to interim manager in 2010, was a minor league coach and manager in the Pirates, Phillies, Expos, and A's systems from 1985 through 1999, and managed at almost every level except for AAA. And then he did manage in AAA in the Cubs system. He was the Cubs AAA manager from 2003 through 2006 before getting promoted to the big league staff in 2007. So kind of similar to Mansolino in that, he wasn't with the organization for super long. He was elevated from being the third base coach for a couple of years to the interim manager, didn't preside over a playoff team, although he won a higher percentage of games in the interim year in a much smaller sample size when he took over in August. They gave him the job. It wasn't a great team. That was the other thing. And it didn't really work out. Next one is Jim Tracy with the 2009 Rockies. This was a team 2 years removed from getting to the World Series, but Clint Hurdle was fired in May of 2009 after an 18-28 start to that season, and Tracy was named interim manager. And Tracy brought that talent maybe back to this team. The talent from 2007 came back. They went 74-42 under Tracy down the stretch and made the playoffs that season. Did lose in the NLDS in the postseason, but it was considered a really, really positive, successful season for the Rockies, and they gave Jim Tracy the full-time job. Now, he had been around a little bit. He was hired as the bench coach for the 2008 season, so he had about a year and change as Hurdle's bench coach before taking over as interim manager. Prior to that, he had been a big league manager, and that's the big difference between Tracy and all these other guys really that I'm talking about. Jim Tracy was the Dodgers manager for 5 seasons from 2001 to 2005. Now, he did have 4 winning seasons out of 5, but 2004 was the only year he took the Dodgers to the playoffs. Not terrible, but not amazing. Then he moved on to manage the Pirates for 2 years in 2006 and 2007. Couldn't fix the Pirates. He won fewer than 70 games in each of those years and was let go and then caught on with the Rockies. So he was a guy with big league managerial experience, which makes it tough to kind of one-on-one compare him to Mansolino, who does not have that. And Tracy had some success, especially with the Dodgers, and he did manage his team as the interim to the playoffs. Tracy then came back in 2010 after getting the extension and the full-time job, and they won 83 games in 2010. They missed the playoffs, but it was a winning record. It was enough for him to stay around. And then they were bad in 2011 and bad in 2012 under Jim Tracy, and he resigned after the 2012 season. I think the Rockies were maybe going to consider firing him anyway after back-to-back bad seasons in Colorado. That one didn't crash and burn, I would say, right? Like, he managed them well at the beginning. They were a solid team the next year, but then after that, it just kind of went downhill and probably not where the Rockies exactly wanted to go after just making the World Series 2 years prior. And the final one is an Orioles example that many of you will remember back in 2007. Sam Perlozzo was fired in June of 2007, and Dave Tremblay was named the interim manager. Now, Tremblay, who at the time was kind of on the major league staff, sometimes the bullpen coach, a little bit as the bench coach in 2007. That was his first year on the big league staff with the Orioles. Previously, he was hired by the O's in 2003 to manage at Double-A. Then he did that for 2 years. Then he managed the Orioles Triple-A team for the next 2 years from 2005 to 2006 and was promoted to the big league coaching staff in 2007. And 3 months in, he was the interim manager. Started off pretty well. He going along in his first 54 games. The Orioles were 29-25 under Tremblay. They were playing pretty solid baseball. And in August, they didn't even wait till the end of the season. They were playing well under Tremblay, and they gave him the vote of confidence, the extension, and said, you are going to be the full-time manager. They removed the interim tag and made him the manager and extended him. On that very same night that the Orioles extended Tremblay, you'll remember one of the most infamous Orioles and Major League Baseball games of all time. The Orioles lost 30-3 to the Texas Rangers that night. Still the MLB record for runs scored in one game by a team, the Rangers with 30 runs, was the day they extended Tremblay. And the bad news with Tremblay at the helm continued from there. The Orioles lost 90-plus games in 2008 in his first full year, then again in 2009. And when they started off 2010 even worse, the Orioles, remember, they fired Brandon Hyde at 15-28 this year. The Orioles started 15-39 in 2010 when they finally fired Dave Tremblay. I think you can honestly say that one did not work out, but there were a lot of managerial hirings for the Orioles between, really, Davey Johnson and Buck Showalter that really didn't work out in Baltimore, as we know. But that was one of the other ones where it's somewhat similar to Mansolino. Now, they didn't give him the vote of confidence during the season, but hey, you take over a team that's really underperforming and you do fairly well, you get the job, and then it crashed and burned for the next 2+ years, and he lost that job. So that's just some history, right? None of these situations are like one-to-one comparisons to Tony Mansolino, but it's Major League Baseball seasons. They're all different. It's hard-pressed to find a situation that'll be exactly like Mansolino went through this year in Baltimore. But just 3 examples on each side to show you, hey, sometimes it works out and sometimes it really doesn't if you keep that interim guy around, especially if you do want to change some of the voice and the messaging in that clubhouse. But the Orioles' managerial job is certainly open at the moment. It could go to Mansolino. It could go to someone else. But the O's, that's not the only opening. There are 7 other openings around Major League Baseball at this point. I'm going to rank them to try to get a feel for where does this O's job stack up for some of the top managerial candidates who are out there on the market. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. And FanDuel's great because it gives you so many ways to play. Parlays, player props, even following the live lines during games. It makes watching football even more exciting when you got a little something riding on the action and you really don't want to watch Cooper Rush play quarterback for the Ravens. So whether you're a casual fan or love diving into the stats, FanDuel makes the game day experience so much better. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. So the Orioles, again, it's possible they give Tony Mansolino this full-time job. But if they don't, the O's are going to be one of, at this point of recording here on Thursday night, 8 managerial openings across Major League Baseball. And the O's are certainly at least in the top half of those 8 in terms of what the managers out there are looking for and which would be the best jobs. But where exactly do they rank? So there are 8 jobs out there. I'm going to start from number 8 to number 1 in my personal rankings of how good these jobs would be. Say, put yourself in the shoes of the best managerial candidate who is looking for a new job this offseason, and say all 8 teams offer you the managerial job. Here's basically the rankings of, if that was me, which ones I would pick in terms of which would be the best job to win and have the best seat there. Number 8, what I would call the worst job probably is the Angels. And I think that's because the organization's just a disaster. They have no idea how to develop talent. You're built to fail. I mean, they couldn't win with Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout on the same roster. How are they going to win with only a lessened version of Mike Trout now? I mean, you could say, Connor, but does anyone even care? I think maybe they do. I mean, they moved on from Ron Washington / his interim manager this year, so they maybe care a little bit. But that franchise is just such a disaster. I'd put that at number 8. Number 7 for me is the Washington Nationals. It's been a disaster front office in the past. Now, they did get rid of not just Davey Martinez, but also their GM Mike Rizzo was out this year. They brought in a new GM from the Red Sox organization. So maybe some different voices in that front office make it different. But their rebuild has not gone as well as they thought. It was a disappointing year for the Nats to be as bad as they were here in 2025. They've won before in that job, so it's possible, but the minor league system doesn't have a lot going for it right now. The major league roster should have more talent than it does at the moment. It'd be a tough job for me to step into. Number 6 would be the Minnesota Twins. There is still some solid talent on this Twins team, which is why I have it at number 6. And they're in arguably the easiest division in baseball in the AL Central, which makes it easier to kind of pop one season and get to the postseason. But their ownership, the Pohlads, have decided they were going to sell. Then they decided not to sell. They're still slashing spending. It's gone way down each of the last 2 seasons since the Twins last won the division in 2023. They fired Rocco Baldelli after back-to-back disappointing years, but he was getting no help from the front office and ownership. It just seems like they might be going into even more sell mode to get rid of money. That's a tough spot to walk into as a manager. Number 5, and you could argue that this is way too high, and let me know right here in the Locked On Orioles YouTube comments. Of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, but also let me know in the comments, where would you change these rankings? You might say, and I would get the argument, this team is way too high on the list, but I'm actually going to put number 5 as the Colorado Rockies. Sounds crazy. Sounds like they should be easily number 8. They finished with the worst record in baseball this year. Their organization is a complete and utter disaster. Here's the reason why I have the Rockies as high as 5. Yes, their organization's been a nightmare. But they moved on from their GM, and in the quote from ownership, they said they are looking at outside candidates to kind of get a new voice in there. The biggest issue with the Rockies over the past few years is that they've been so insular. They've only been hiring people in the front office from inside the Rockies. This is a team that's, people have said they're 10, 15, maybe 20 years behind kind of the data and analytics revolution in baseball in terms of the technology they use, which is putting them behind the 8 ball because everything's just been so inside the Rockies with no outside ideas. If they're going to bring in an outside GM, maybe this is the time they can finally change things. They have an owner who, though might not be great at the baseball part of it, is willing to spend his money on the team. There's not a lot of pressure to win at this point. It is a very, very tough NL West. That's the tough part of it. But if a new GM knows what they're doing and the owner is willing to spend, the Rockies have gotten to the postseason in the past, even when the Dodgers have been good, and they could do it again. I mean, the Padres could be going the other direction with all the money they have locked up and all those big contracts. The Giants are perpetually going to go 500, and the D-backs might be cutting spending again. So maybe there's an opening for the Rockies. And if you're a manager who can get it on the ground floor, if things are starting to change in Colorado, might not be a very bad job. And there's not going to be big expectations on you in year 1 when they just won 43 games. Number 4 on my list would be the San Francisco Giants. Good talent on that roster. You just acquired Rafael Devers. You have good pitching development, but you also have Buster Posey there. And kind of a wild card at this point in terms of Posey leading that front office. It's also a really hard division. It's also kind of hard to get players to sign in San Francisco. It's a tough place to hit. They have trouble luring in the big free agent. They've continuously had trouble with that. That's why they had to trade for a guy like Rafael Devers. And there's a lot of pressure to win there. I mean, they've had some good teams that just haven't won. They've been kind of, as I said, perpetually 500 for the past few years. There's going to be pressure for a manager to come in, have that be the next step, and get them back to the postseason. And if you don't do that in the first 2 years, pressure is right back on you. So while this is the more talented team, I think there's the most pressure maybe on that Giants job. Number 3 for me would be the Texas Rangers. A lot of talent on that team. You still got Seager and Semien and Jacob deGrom and the likes, some good young players. And also not a lot of pressure because they just won. They won the 2023 World Series. Your fans are not expecting you to turn it around and win the 2026 World Series in your first year. If I'm a Rangers fan, I'm still riding the high of that World Series from 2 years ago. So not much pressure to win immediately. They have a lot of talent on the team. The division doesn't look amazing right now that they play in. The only reason they're not higher is because some of the reporting that's come out since they've moved on from Bruce Bochy is that they might be looking to take a little step back in terms of payroll, maybe not a full teardown rebuild, but a little mini retool sell-off that could have a bit of a step back, at least in 2026. And if you're a manager coming in, you don't know if that means they're going to spend again in the next couple of years or if they are really cutting back. That would be the only reason why they're down at number 3. Number 2 for me is the Orioles. This is still a team with a lot of young talent, a rich owner who has plenty of room and money to spend on this team to make it better. A team that is coming off back-to-back playoff appearances, certainly had a big disappointment in 2025. But again, with still being such a young crew of talent, if it can stay healthy, this is a team that could easily get back to being really, really good in 2026. Maybe just looking for a manager to put them over the top. Now, is there a lot of pressure on the next manager coming into Baltimore? Yes, there is. And there's questions about the level of the talent on this team. And there's questions about if Rubenstein and Elias are willing to spend. That's why the Orioles job, I think, is number 2 and not number 1. Number 1 for me is the Braves. They still have a great core of players together. Yes, it was a disappointing year, but it still looks like a winning roster, an organization that's willing to spend, an organization with a good front office that's run things well. And while there is pressure, it's still only been 4 years since they won the World Series. So it's not like there's some long drought that you need to end as the manager. It's kind of a perfect spot to come in with veteran talent. You don't need to be the most veteran manager who comes in and sets the tone. You can be a younger manager and have success in that role, I think, as well. That's why I think the Braves are number 1. But let me know in the YouTube comments what I got right and wrong in those rankings, the best jobs available this offseason. If the Orioles really are number 2 on that list of 8, they should be able to have pretty much their pick of the best managers who are out there. And hopefully they do make the right decision on whomever they hire. And whenever they make that decision, we'll have it covered right here on the pod. But we are back next week. That'll do it for this week. The episodes continue. No Orioles games, unfortunately, in the postseason, but still we have 5 episodes per week coming at you next week. On Monday, I'll be looking back on my bold predictions that I did in March for this 2025 Orioles season. I made them very bold for a reason. Here's a hint. None of the 4 of them came true, but I'm going to dive into how off they really were because you got to keep yourself in check. We'll do that on Monday's episode. Then later in the week, I'm going to give you the 3 reasons why the Orioles will turn it around in 2026. And then I'm going to give you the 3 reasons why they won't turn it around in 2026. We're going to dive into a lot more, and including a first check-in on, hey, how did all those trades look, at least for the 2 months after the Orioles made them at the deadline? That's all coming up next week on the pod starting Monday. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.